The night settles softly over the frontier, and a quiet breeze moves through the tall grass, as if whispering stories forgotten by time. In that calm, it's easy to imagine a lone frontiersman making camp beneath a sky overflowing with stars, the only light coming from a slow-burning fire he built with practiced hands. Survival out here was never an accident. Every movement, every decision, was shaped by skills passed from one wanderer to another, skills that could mean the difference between life and never being seen again. As he worked, he chose his campsite with almost scientific precision. Frontiersmen never slept in low spots where cold air collected, nor too close to rivers where nighttime fog soaked through every blanket. They sought a slight rise in the land, protected by natural windbreaks, like fallen logs or clusters of thick brush. Without modern weather forecasts, they read the sky with remarkable accuracy, the color of the sunset, the speed of drifting clouds, even the scent of moisture in the air. A deep red horizon, often a sign of dry weather ahead, a halo around the moon, almost certain rain. Before resting, he gathered dry grass, pine needles, and small twigs, arranging them the way older travelers had taught him, not in a pile, but in a tiny open nest that breathed easily. With a piece of flint and the back of his knife, he struck sparks until they found the waiting fibers. The method was old, borrowed from both Native American tribes and European woodsmen, perfected over generations. They believed a fire should never be too large. A small flame was safer, harder to spot by unwanted eyes, and much easier to maintain through the dark hours. He set a pot of water near the flame, knowing he must boil it even if it looked clear. Many newcomers learned the hard way that streams in the wild carried all kinds of invisible dangers. Experienced frontiersmen boiled everything, sometimes twice, not because they understood bacteria, but because experience had proven that clear water can still make a strong man weak. As the fire crackled, he laid out strips of dried venison he'd prepared earlier. Frontiersmen were masters of preservation. With no refrigeration, they relied on smoke, sun, and salt. Meat was sliced thin, hung high above a smoky fire, and left for hours. Properly dried, it could last weeks. Some even ground dried meat into powder and mixed it with fat and berries, creating a high-calorie food called something native tribes had shared, a food so efficient that explorers later called it the original energy bar. Before sleep, he inspected his boots. It might seem a small detail, but frontier veterans knew that a man could survive without a rifle longer than he could survive without good footwear. Wet leather stiffened overnight, so they stuffed their boots with dry grass to hold their shape and absorb moisture. It wasn't glorious, but it kept their feet warm, and warm feet kept a traveler moving, and moving meant living. Finally, as the fire dimmed, he wrapped himself in a blanket. As dawn crept across the horizon, the frontiersman stirred before the sun had fully risen, guided not by an alarm but by years of instinct. The morning air was cool and carried the faint scent of pine and dew-soaked earth. Out here, waking early wasn't discipline, it was survival. The first light gave a man time to assess his surroundings, check for changes in the landscape, and make sure no visitors, human or animal, had approached during the night. The first task of the morning was always to rekindle the fire. Frontiersmen rarely started from scratch if they could avoid it. Instead of letting the fire die overnight, they buried embers under a small pile of ash, where they stayed warm for hours. In the morning, he brushed the ash aside and fed the glowing coals dry grass and thin twigs. Within moments, tiny flames flickered back to life. This method wasn't just practical, it saved flint, saved energy, and saved precious minutes that could mean everything on a cold morning. Once the fire was stable, he prepared a simple breakfast. Many frontiersmen relied on a mixture of cornmeal and water cooked into a thick mush called Johnny Cake. It wasn't glamorous, but it provided steady energy and required only ingredients that stored well. Sometimes, for extra strength, they added a bit of animal fat or dried fruit. The nutritional balance might seem basic today, but in reality, it offered the perfect combination of carbohydrates and calories for long days of travel. While he ate, he sharpened his knife using smooth river stones he'd collected along the way. The knife was more than a tool. It was an all-purpose instrument used for building shelters, preparing food, cutting rope, shaping wood, and even creating traps. A dull blade was dangerous. It required more force to use, making accidents far more likely. So every morning, frontiersmen dedicated time to maintaining their blades, treating the process like a quiet ritual. He next checked the condition of his powder horn and rifle. A weapon on the frontier wasn't only for defense. It was a source of food, material, and protection. But gunpowder was sensitive to moisture, so it had to be stored carefully. Many frontiersmen sealed their horns with wax and wrapped them in cloth to prevent dampness from creeping in. They cleaned their rifles regularly, even when they hadn't fired a shot. Dust, humidity, and grime could ruin a weapon faster than battle. Before breaking camp, he scanned the ground for animal tracks. Reading tracks was an essential frontier skill, one often learned from Native American tribes who had perfected it over centuries. Tracks could reveal what passed through during the night. Deer, useful for food. Wolves, typically harmless but worth noting. Or a bear, which required more caution. By studying the shape, depth, and direction of prints, the frontiersman could tell not only what animal had been there, but how fast it was moving, whether it was alone, and sometimes even whether it was hungry. Finally, he inspected the sky. Clouds told stories to those who knew how to read them. Thin, wispy cirrus clouds meant fair weather for the day. Thick, rolling cumulonimbus clouds warned of storms. He watched the wind direction as well, using smoke from his fire as a guide. If the smoke drifted low and hovered, it meant humidity was rising, usually a sign of incoming rain. With everything checked and packed, by midday, the frontiersman was deep within the woodland, traveling along narrow game trails carved long before humans ever set foot there. These paths wound between old-growth trees, whose trunks were wide enough to hide a man completely. Moving along them wasn't just easier, it was strategic. Animals always chose the safest, most efficient routes, and following their trails helped the frontiersman conserve energy while navigating the vast frontier. As he walked, he kept his senses tuned to the forest around him. Every sound meant something. The rhythmic tap of a woodpecker signaled insects beneath the bark. The sudden silence of songbirds could warn of a predator nearby. Even the rustle of leaves carried meaning. A light, quick flutter might be a squirrel leaping tree to tree, while a heavier, measured crackle could be a deer or something larger. To survive out here, listening became second nature, an unending conversation with the wilderness. Around noon he paused to refill his water. Frontiersmen relied on natural signs to find clean sources, the direction of animal tracks, the presence of lush vegetation, and the sound of distant movement. He found a narrow stream trickling down a slope, its water cold and fast-moving, a good sign it was safe to drink. Still, he used a simple frontier trick, letting the water settle in a small depression in the dirt, allowing sediment to sink before he scooped it up. Boiling was ideal, but not always possible, so these methods helped reduce risk when traveling light. Continuing on, he came across a series of claw marks on a tree. They were spaced far apart and higher than his head, a clear sign a black bear had sharpened its claws or marked its territory. Experienced frontiersmen understood that most wild animals avoided humans unless threatened, so he simply noted the marks and adjusted his path. Out here, fear wasn't useful. Awareness was. He soon reached a clearing where tall grass swayed gently in the breeze. This was the perfect place to gather food. Contrary to the dramatic stories told in taverns, frontiersmen didn't hunt large game every day. It was risky, loud, and required significant resources. Instead, they relied heavily on foraging. He knelt to inspect patches of greenery, searching for plants he recognized. Lamb's quarter, a leafy wild green richer in nutrients than many vegetables today. Wild onions whose scent gave them away, and choke cherries which could be eaten fresh or dried into nutrient-dense cakes that lasted months. Every plant he picked was chosen with care. Foraging mistakes could be fatal, so frontiersmen built their knowledge slowly, often learning from local tribes who had been stewards of the land long before colonists arrived. He crushed a leaf between his fingers and smelled it, a fast way to distinguish safe plants from dangerous ones. Once satisfied, he added the gathered greens and berries to his pouch, securing valuable calories for later. As the afternoon light softened, he took a moment to repair part of his gear. Frontier life meant constant maintenance, torn straps, frayed rope, worn leather. He sat on a fallen log, using sinew thread to reinforce the seam of his moccasin. Moccasins, though simple, were preferred by many frontiersmen because they allowed silence in the forest and dried faster than heavy boots. The trade-off was durability, meaning they needed frequent care. But this quiet work also became a moment of calm reflection, a rare pause in an otherwise demanding world. Before moving on, he checked his bearings using a method older than compass navigation, observing the sun's position and the shadow it cast. By determining how short or long the shadow was, he could estimate both the time of day and direction. Even on cloudy days, as the afternoon drifted toward evening, the frontiersmen began searching for a suitable place to make camp. One of the most important survival skills on the frontier was recognizing a safe location before darkness fell. Open plains left a man exposed, dense forests hid too many sounds, and riverbanks could flood without warning, so he looked for something experienced woodsmen understood well: high, dry ground with a natural windbreak. He found it near the base of a rocky rise, where a cluster of cedar trees grew together in a tight semicircle. Cedars were prized by frontiersmen. Their branches offered shelter from rain, their wood burned hot even when damp, and their scent naturally repelled insects. This spot was ideal. He set down his gear and ran his hand along the soil. It was firm and slightly elevated, meaning water would drain away rather than pool beneath him during the night. Setting up camp wasn't a grand affair like in movies. Frontiersmen traveled light, so their shelters were simple but effective. He took out his oilcloth, a treated sheet of canvas every frontiersman carried, and stretched it between two trees, fastening it with cords of braided rawhide. This created a lean-to that angled rain away and trapped warmth beneath it. The open front faced east, so the cold western winds wouldn't reach him. Once shelter was ready, he gathered dry twigs and bark from beneath deadfall. Contrary to common belief, frontiersmen didn't cut green wood for fires. Green wood smokes excessively and burns poorly. Instead, he searched for pieces that snapped cleanly, a sign they were dry inside. He built a small fire using a classic frontier technique called a feather stick, curling shavings of wood that caught flame quickly without needing kindling. The fire crackled softly as dusk fell, and with it came the familiar chorus of the wilderness. Owls began their slow, rhythmic calls. Crickets chirped in steady waves. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote announced the coming night. These sounds weren't frightening to a frontiersman, they were reassuring, signs that nature was following its usual rhythm, and nothing unusual prowled nearby. For dinner, he relied on the food he had foraged earlier. He added handfuls of wild greens and berries to a tin cup of water, heating it near the flames. It wasn't fancy, but frontier meals rarely were. Nutrition mattered more than taste, and wild plants often carried more vitamins than anything preserved or transported. If he'd been lucky enough to snare a rabbit or catch a fish, he might have roasted it, but such opportunities weren't guaranteed. Today, the forest provided enough. As the light dimmed, he performed a routine every seasoned frontiersman knew: securing the perimeter. This wasn't a defensive measure in the dramatic sense. He wasn't expecting bandits or beasts, but a practical one. He hung small strips of cloth smeared with animal fat at the edge of camp. When nighttime creatures brushed against them, the faint rustle would alert him without startling the animals. It allowed him to remain aware while still conserving precious energy. Before settling in, he examined the sky. Frontier survival often depended on weather prediction, and the sky told stories long before storms arrived. A red glow along the horizon meant dry weather tomorrow. High, thin clouds warned of a change within 2 days. Frontiersmen learned to read these signs because rain could destroy supplies, extinguish fires, or turn trails into dangerous mud. Satisfied with what he saw, he returned to the warmth of his small fire. He sharpened his knife with slow, steady movements, a nightly ritual that ensured his most important tool remained reliable. A sharp blade wasn't just for cutting, it was for making traps, processing food, repairing gear, and even crafting new tools. The frontiersman awoke before sunrise, not because of danger, but because of habit. Out here, daylight was more valuable than gold. He stretched his limbs, stiff from the cool night air, and stirred the ashes of the fire. In the frontier, coals were rarely left to die. A well-banked fire could smolder for hours, needing only a breath of wind and a handful of dry twigs to awaken again. With practiced motions, he coaxed the fire back to life, the warm glow pushing away the last shadows of night. Breakfast was simple: a bit of dried meat softened over the flames and crushed berries mixed into leftover greens. But frontiersmen didn't just eat for taste. They ate strategically: fats for warmth, berries for vitamins, and greens to prevent scurvy long before many settlers understood its cause. Native tribes had taught early woodsmen which plants restored strength after long journeys, and those lessons had become essential for survival. With his gear packed and the fire safely extinguished, he began preparing for one of the most important tasks of frontier life: navigating without maps. Contrary to popular belief, maps didn't cover most of the wilderness. Much of the land hadn't been charted, and even when maps existed, they were often outdated or inaccurate. So the frontiersman relied on a skill passed down from both tribal guides and seasoned trappers reading the land. He studied the way the morning mist clung to the low ground, revealing where water collected. He observed how the tops of distant trees leaned subtly, shaped by steady prevailing winds. He felt the texture of the soil beneath his moccasins. Soft earth meant he was close to a creek, while dry, sandy patches suggested old riverbeds. These natural clues acted like signposts, guiding him far more reliably than any paper map ever could. As he moved deeper into the wilderness, he found signs of recent animal movement. A hoofprint pressed into mud, still holding a thin sheen of water, told him a deer had passed within the hour. A pinnacone torn apart suggested a porcupine had been feeding. Even scat, often ignored by inexperienced travelers, was a valuable source of information. Its shape, moisture, and contents helped frontiersmen identify nearby wildlife. Knowing what animals lived in an area also told them which predators might be lurking as well. A few miles later, he reached a fallen tree whose bark had been stripped away in long, deliberate strokes. This was the work of a beaver, and beaver signs were precious on the frontier. Their dams created ponds full of fish, and their pelts were among the most valuable trade items in North America. But frontiersmen didn't hunt beavers carelessly. They studied their movements, their lodges, and even the structure of their dams to understand the best time to set traps. Today, though, he wasn't trapping, he was learning the land in case he returned during fur season. As the day warmed, the frontiersman stopped beside an open meadow where tall grass moved like waves in the wind. Meadows were ideal places to look for medicinal plants. Frontier medicine wasn't advanced, but it was surprisingly effective, thanks to indigenous knowledge. He knelt beside a cluster of yarrow, a feathery plant whose leaves could stop bleeding when crushed. A little farther, he recognized goldenrod, useful for soothing sore muscles. These natural remedies filled the role of medicine chests long before doctors were common in remote settlements. He didn't need them today, but he harvested a small amount anyway, placing them carefully in his pouch. Frontier wisdom taught that preparation was the difference between life and death. A twist. By late afternoon, the forest began to change. The trees grew thinner, the canopy opened wider, and sunlight spilled onto the forest floor in warm golden patches. This sign told the frontiersman he was approaching a river valley. Waterways were the lifelines of the frontier highways, food sources, and natural guides through the wilderness. But they were also dangerous. Rivers hid deep currents, slippery banks, and predators both above and below the surface. Before reaching the water itself, he stopped to read the land. The shape of the terrain mattered. A sudden dip in the ground meant the riverbank might be unstable. Thick, lush plants often concealed deep mud that could swallow a man to the knee. Frontiersmen learned to look for high sign, patches of gravel or rocky earth where animals frequently crossed. If deer used that path, it meant the footing was safe. When he finally saw the river through the trees, he paused. It flowed steady and dark, carrying the scent of cold stone from mountains far upstream. In the frontier era, water clarity often revealed what it contained. Clear water ran fast, and was usually safe to drink after boiling. Murky water held silt, or worse, decay from aperture. Today, the river ran clean, though strong enough to demand respect. Before approaching, the frontiersman crouched low and scanned the opposite bank. This wasn't about fear, it was awareness. Beavers, otters, deer, and sometimes wolves came to drink here, and early tribes often used rivers as travel routes. Many frontiersmen knew enough respect to avoid stumbling into someone else's territory unannounced. Satisfied that the area was calm, he stepped closer and knelt at the water's edge. He dipped his fingers in, feeling the temperature. Cold, good for preserving fish, good for drinking, but dangerous if a crossing went wrong. Hypothermia claimed many unprepared travelers, even in mild weather. He took out a small tin cup, filled it, and placed it near the sun-warmed stones to settle. Frontiersmen often used sunlight as a natural purifier. While it didn't replace boiling, It helped settle sediment and warm the water enough to avoid shocking the stomach. Before drinking, he studied the animal tracks in the soft mud. Some were fresh, a pair of raccoon prints, messy little hands poking around for crayfish. A larger print, a deer, pointed downstream. Tracks acted like a frontier newspaper, who came through, when and whether danger lingered. He followed the deer tracks a short distance until he found what he was hoping for, a narrow place in the river where stones broke the surface. These stepping stone crossings were used by animals long before humans. If hooves could cross safely, a careful man could too. But he wasn't crossing today. Instead, he used the shallow water to fish. Fishing was a skill every frontiersman relied on, not because it was easy, but because it was dependable. He selected a thin branch for a pole and pulled from his pouch a small bone hook, carved weeks earlier from a deer's leg, sharpened and polished. Bone hooks were common before metal ones became easier to trade for. They worked well, especially when baited with insects foraged near the bank. He waded into the shallows, feeling the river pull at his legs. Patience was the true tool of the frontier fisherman. He watched the shifting shadows beneath the water, waiting for movement. Minutes turned into more minutes, but time meant little out here. Eventually, a quick silver flash darted near the hook. A trout, small but valuable. A sudden tug, a careful pull, and the fish was his. He thanked the river, a habit learned from indigenous neighbors who taught that respect maintained balance. He cleaned the trout by the water's edge, using a sharpened stone to scrape it open. Bones and guts were tossed downstream, where other creatures would make use of them. Nothing in the frontier ever went to waste. As the sun dipped lower, streaking the sky with amber light, he carried the fish back to the campsite he would form for the evening. The river had provided food and guidance, but it also with the river behind him and evening settling in, the frontiersman followed a ridge that overlooked the valley. Traveling along ridgelines was an old technique, learned from native scouts and experienced trappers. Higher ground meant fewer obstacles, clearer sightlines, and less chance of surprising or being surprised by large animals. From here, he could see the forest stretching endlessly, its treetops glowing copper under the fading sun. As he walked, he noticed subtle changes in the environment, the way the breeze cooled, the way the forest sounds shifted. These signs told him night was approaching faster than expected. Frontier travelers rarely waited until dark to make camp. The last half hour of daylight was the most valuable part of the day. You used it to prepare, to secure warmth, to organize supplies while visibility was still good. He descended into a small hollow where spruce and fir trees clustered close together. These trees offered dense cover, and their fallen needles created a soft, springy floor, perfect for a quiet night's rest. Before selecting a spot, he scanned the area for signs of animal bedding. Elk and deer often slept in hollows like this, flattening the ground. If he saw their tracks or indents, he would move on. Sharing a sleeping spot with a startled elk was not on any frontiersman's list of wise decisions. Finding an untouched patch of ground, he began gathering spruce branches. Their needles released a sharp, clean scent, and, when layered thickly, formed a surprisingly warm mattress. Frontier travelers didn't carry bulky blankets for padding. Nature provided better comfort than anything they could haul on their backs. With his bedding prepared, he inspected the surrounding trees. The spruce branches above him were tight and interwoven, creating a natural roof that caught dew and deflected rain. He added an extra layer by stretching his oilcloth diagonally between two trunks, angling it to guide water away should a nighttime drizzle arrive. Next came the fire, but a different kind than before. At night, frontiersmen used a long fire, a technique common among indigenous winter camps. It involved placing two long logs parallel to each other, allowing a slow, steady burn that lasted hours without needing constant feeding. Because he didn't want to draw attention or light up the forest like a beacon, he kept the flames low and contained, letting the heat radiate rather than blaze. He cleaned the trout he had caught earlier, skewering it on a thin green branch and holding it near the coals. The smell of cooking fish mingled with the resin of the spruce, creating an earthy aroma that blended naturally with the forest. Meals like this weren't feasts, but they were enough, and more importantly, they reminded him he belonged to the rhythms of this landscape. When he finished eating, he checked his gear once more. Frontier nights could be unpredictable. A sudden drop in temperature, a curious animal, a change in the weather. Preparedness wasn't paranoia, it was the quiet confidence that allowed a man to rest. He hung his food pouch from a high branch, well out of reach of raccoons and other nighttime thieves. He placed his powder horn and rifle within arm's reach, not for battle, but for safety. A startled bear or boar could be dangerous even if it meant no harm. And he circled. The night passed quietly, and by early dawn the air turned cool and silver. Before opening his eyes, the frontiersman listened, a habit developed over years in the wilderness. Morning in the forest always began with sound. First came the thin, wavering call of a hermit thrush, rising through the dimness like a soft flute. Then the rustling of small animals, beginning their daily routines. Even the distant river seemed to hum a little louder as the world brightened. He sat up slowly, brushing a few fallen needles from his coat. The long fire had collapsed into faintly glowing bands of charcoal, still warm enough to rekindle with a bit of breath and a dry twig. Frontier travelers knew how precious a leftover ember could be. It saved time, and more importantly, it saved effort. Building a fire from cold flint in the early morning, with numb fingers, was no man's idea of comfort. As the flame regained its life, he warmed his hands. The heat moved across his knuckles, easing the stiffness that always came after sleeping on the ground. No matter how soft the spruce bedding had been, he unwrapped a small pouch of parched corn and dried berries, lightweight food often carried by native scouts and long hunters. It wasn't a feast, but soaked briefly in warm water, it made a simple breakfast that filled the body steadily. After eating, he cleaned his small tin pot with sand from the ground, scouring gently until the inside shone enough to use again. In the wilderness, one pot could last a man years if treated with respect. Tools weren't just items, they were lifelines. When the sun finally broke the horizon, its light filtered through the spruce trees in narrow golden beams. He took a moment to enjoy the warmth, letting it sink into his shoulders. The day promised fair weather. The sky held no signs of haze or gathering clouds, and the air carried a dry, crisp cleanliness that often preceded long stretches of calm. Today's travel required careful thinking. He checked the compass he carried, but he relied more on the natural markers around him. The moss patterns on the north sides of tree trunks, the gentle slope of the land that hinted at where the river curved next, the distant ridges etched softly against the morning sky. In the frontier, man-made tools were helpful, but nature, when understood, was more trustworthy. He followed a narrow game trail leading away from his campsite. Trails like these formed over decades as deer, elk, and other animals moved through the same routes year after year. They were quiet, predictable, and often connected important natural features, water sources, salt licks, protected valleys. Skilled travelers used them like hidden highways. As he walked, the forest changed character. The tall, shadowy spruce thinned, giving way to a mixed woodland of oak, birch, and maple. Their leaves rustled softly in the rising breeze, a gentler, more open sound compared to the close whisper of the conifers. The sunlight scattered in patches along the ground, revealing tracks of animals that had passed during the night. The frontiersman knelt by a set of prints pressed clearly into the damp soil. Deer, a doe with a fawn following her. Light, delicate impressions, the kind that showed cautious steps. He studied them out of habit, noting direction and freshness. Learning to read tracks was like reading a book written in the language of the land. Every mark told a story. After several miles, as the frontiersman left the meadow behind, the land began to rise gently, forming a series of long, rolling ridges. These natural elevations were more than just obstacles. They served as quiet guides for anyone who understood their language. Most ridges in the region tended to run in long, predictable lines, shaped by ancient glacial movements thousands of years earlier. By following them, a traveler could keep orientation even without a clear view of the sky. The climb was steady but never steep. His steps pressed softly into the leaf litter, releasing faint scents of crushed oak and birch. Each ridge he crossed offered a slightly different view, a sloping valley here, a dense stand of pines there, the glimmer of moving water somewhere in the distance. From these high points, frontiersmen could often spot signs of game or smoke from distant camps long before reaching them. At the top of the third ridge, he paused to study the terrain. A narrow stream flowed below, winding through the trees like a silver thread. The way it bent sharply at one point told him something important. Water often found the easiest path downhill, and where a stream twisted like that, there was usually softer ground nearby. It might be marshy, it might be unstable. It might even host predators that favored such wet areas. so he chose a different approach, circling from the higher ground to keep his steps dry and safe. As he descended, the air grew cooler. The canopy overhead thickened again, muted with the deep greens of mature pine. The needles cushioned his footsteps, making his movements nearly silent. This quietness wasn't accidental. Generations of hunters and scouts learned to move this way, distributing their weight evenly, rolling the foot softly heel to toe. It wasn't just for stalking, it prevented unwanted attention from animals that might pose danger. Near the edge of the stream, he found something else. Claw marks on a fallen log. Deep, deliberate scratches raked across the bark. They were old. The wood had started to gray around the edges, but they told a familiar story. A black bear had visited this area, likely using the log to mark territory or sharpen its claws. Bears rarely sought conflict unless startled, but their presence reminded him to stay aware. The forest didn't belong to him. He was a guest passing through. He continued on, following the stream only loosely, keeping it within hearing distance rather than sight. Frontier travelers often used the sound of running water as a guide, safer than staying right at its edge, where footprints remained visible and rivals, animal or human, might patrol. The gentle burbling sound drifted through the forest like a constant, peaceful companion. As midday approached, sunlight filtered through an opening ahead, revealing a wider clearing shaped by nature's slow work. Years ago, perhaps a storm had toppled several trees here, allowing new growth to sprout in a patchwork of young saplings and shrubs. These clearings were rich with resources: berries in the warmer months, edible shoots in early spring, and herbs used by native healers for generations. He knelt to examine a cluster of plants with narrow leaves and the sun was beginning its slow descent, stretching long amber beams across the forest floor as the frontiersmen moved deeper into the wilderness. Evening in the frontier had a rhythm of its own, not hurried, not frightening, but gently persuasive, urging any traveler to think ahead about shelter, warmth, and the long hours of darkness. He scanned the land with a practiced eye. A good campsite wasn't simply a place to lie down. It was a combination of protection, resources, and quiet. Too close to water, and he risked animals wandering through at night. Too close to open ground, and the wind would cut straight through his bedroll. What he needed was something subtle, a natural alcove where the land curved inward, sheltered by trees and shielded by the terrain. He found it just as the sky began to deepen into dusk. A small rise covered with young cedars and soft moss. Cedars were a gift to frontier travelers. Their branches didn't just provide cover. The needles released a faint, calming scent that repelled insects better than many folk remedies. Indigenous tribes had long used cedar in their shelters for exactly this reason. A piece of wisdom the frontiersman had gratefully adopted. He set down his pack and began gathering materials for a fire. Dry twigs from dead branches, bark from a fallen log, and a handful of pine needles for quick ignition. Firemaking was both art and science. Even with flint and steel, sparks meant nothing if the tinder wasn't arranged like a tiny, breathable nest. He worked slowly, gently, coaxing each spark until finally the flame caught and began its quiet, dancing glow. As the fire grew, so did the soft circle of warmth around him. Shadows flickered against the trees, stretching and shrinking with each breeze. He set a small pot over the flame and boiled the water he'd collected earlier. Boiling was the simplest and most reliable purification method available to frontiersmen, a necessity in lands where one could never be entirely certain what had drifted downstream. While the water heated, he prepared a small meal: dried venison cut into thin strips, softened by the steam rising from the pot. Food on the frontier wasn't glamorous, but every bite carried a sense of self-reliance. Everything he ate, he'd earned through knowledge, patience, and respect for the land. When he finally settled down to eat, he felt the day's miles ease out of his muscles. The crackling fire, the scent of cedar, the slow cooling of the evening air, all of it blended into a kind of peaceful stillness. Above him, the first stars appeared like distant campfires scattered across the sky. He lay back on his bedroll, using his pack as a pillow. From this angle, the treetops framed the heavens perfectly. Long before compasses were common, long before frontiersmen mapped these lands, the stars had been their guides. Polaris, steady and unmoving, showed them north. The slow arc of constellations helped them measure time through the night. Knowing the sky was as essential as knowing how to track a deer or build a fire. A distant owl hooted a long, low call drifting through the forest.